So, how many people watched the State of the Union address last night? Not a one of you? Not one of you. But nothing else is in it. Did you watch part of it? You walk by and saw
a little clip on YouTube that
They used to watch those. They're always entertaining. And actually, if you like Obama, it's a good speech. It's not going anywhere. So, what is of interest to your younger brothers and sisters, but not to you? That's nice. Yes. Federally paid free community college. That's the proposal he has on the table. So his argument is we shouldn't stop at high school anymore. We should go all the way through community college. And he says, and as you'll see, I have no idea what comes up with this. Let's go back to community college. He says this is going to cost the federal government $60 billion over the next 10 years. So before we do a little supply and demand analysis, we'll do a little math just to sort of puzzle ourselves. How many people do you think there are in community colleges in the United States? Right now, this year, no one's saying right now. There are 10.3 million other people in four-year undergraduate programs other than community college. So there are 17 million students in post-high school, not yet graduate school. There are actually 3 million students in graduate school. So those are the subjects. We're going to come back to this 3 or 4 times for the rest of the quarter. But you can see pretty clearly what the payoff is from going to some sort of post-high school or even getting a high school degree. So you don't have to do the math very fast. If you pick $10 an hour as a minimum wage, so we're not there yet, but we're approaching it. $10 an hour is about $10 an hour is about $20,000 a year. So if you don't have a high school degree, you're going to make $20,000 a year or less on average. These are median incomes in the United States for people with various degrees. And your high school degree helps you a little bit. Getting an associate's degree at a community college bumps you up quite a bit, $13,000 a year, from almost 13. You go up another $10,000 for getting a BS. And those of you that want to suffer through the vagaries of getting a master's degree, you get another $13,000. It's not so bad if you do it in a year. But there are real payoffs to doing this. And the fact of the matter is that a huge number of jobs, I would say, I shouldn't just put it in terms of a huge number of jobs. 80% of jobs now, they're looking at what your education level is at high school. So you can't step into these other jobs. So there's obviously a demand for that. There's a big payoff associated with it. But I don't think a lot of planning went into this. I'm actually a huge fan of the idea of free community college, because I figured that just means you get the first 2 years of college free, and the rest of college is too bloody expensive. So you get, at least you're getting some discount. But again, I don't expect this to happen. But we can look and let's see what happens in various markets. So let's look at, first we'll look at community colleges, and then we'll look at 4-year colleges, and then we'll look at for-profit. tuition at Seattle Community Colleges is now $4,000. So we'll say that's the equilibrium price. What do you think the average price these days? I'm gonna do different prices. So, it's one of you learn anything. I can't do anything. So I don't think Obama had in mind for-profit colleges. I think he was talking about public community colleges. He was talking about subsidized things. But we now have a market. There exists a market out there. And we're not going to go into all the subsidies and all the how they deal with scholarships and how they price discriminate. We'll come back to that. But there are equilibrium. Let's just assume there are equilibrium prices in these markets. We'll take note to start off with. This is tuition and room and board at four-year colleges. In public four-year colleges, it averages $15,500. In private, it's almost $40,000, and for-profit, it's about $23,000. So there's a lot of money being spent on this stuff. And let's just assume for a second, I can't do these big numbers in my head. So what do you get when you do that multiplication? I get $28 billion. Now somehow, Obama gets a discount rate that gets him to $60 billion over 10 years. So I think first of all, the number he's looking at is way off. So even with the number of students we have now, if the federal government is going to pick up the tab, the cost of that tab is going to be $28 billion. $28 billion to do it. So this is an incredibly expensive program. And I think his actual proposal, if you looked at it closely, would say that the states are going to pay, I think, 25% of it. So states would have to opt in. But it's not cheap. So what do you think is going to happen in these markets? Let's start with the community college market. What's going to happen to the demand for community college education the first 2 years? And why is it going to go up? Okay, price is going to zero, right? So we're moving along. So all these people that are already on this demand curve are already somehow going to have a lot more people that are going to be involved in this particular sort of education. But what else is going to happen? You're going to have a whole bunch of other people who aren't going to college now and are doing what?
That aren't going to college, or?
That are not going to college now.
What are they going to do? They're going to go back to school.
They're going back to school. So we're going to have all these people sitting out there who's saying, they may not even be graduating from high school because they don't think it's worth it, but now they're sitting there going, someone's going to pay for this. Either they can look at it two ways. I don't have to work for a couple of years, maybe my parents will let me save paths going to school. Or they look at this and go, wow, this is a pretty big payoff. I need to go get an associate's degree. So you're going to have all these people that are doing that. So, and they're probably, so we're out here somewhere where this, if this is 7 million, this may be 15, I don't know what the number is. It could be 15 million, there's some big number there. Okay. What's going to happen to private colleges in the University of Washington, in WSU, in Seattle U, and all that? Sort of. Think for a second. Where are they going to shrink? Freshman and sophomore years. So all of a sudden in community colleges, you're going to have this huge increase in demand because it's going to shift out. These people are now going to move over that way. These are going to go down, at least in the short run, as people substitute out of four-year institutions and private institutions. And in theory, at least, it's going to put downward pressure on these. But imagine for a second if you're paying, I mean, what is tuition? Yeah. Is room, tuition room?
Well, I don't know about the board, but room, but that's.
It's 53.
That's a lot. No, I'm just thinking my younger daughter graduated 2 years ago from MIT. She went to Sarah Lawrence for 2 years. And Sarah Lawrence at the time was the most expensive school in the country. And I think at that time it was $52,000. So I mean, everybody must be going to the ceiling. Interestingly enough, Harvard and Princeton and Yale are less because they have huge endowments, so they don't need to charge us. It's the reason Sarah Lawrence is one of the most expensive in the country is it has no endowment. So everything comes out of cash flow. So what we're going to see, at least initially, is there's going to be this huge pressure in the community college market. So whatever the subsidy the federal government is planning on doing, they're going to have to up the subsidy over time in order to get these institutions to expand. Because I mean, just how many of you are freshmen and sophomores? Yeah, I mean, your parents are going to be sitting there going, yeah, you go get a Jesuit education for a couple of years, or you go someplace and do your English and your math and your chemistry and whatever you're going to do at one of the community colleges, and then you go to Seattle or then you go to W. But in any case, what you're doing is you're doing this huge decision on the part of millions and millions of people of where do we spend our money, at least initially. So these community colleges are going to have to expand in a huge way. And the subsidies are going to have to expand in a huge way. And it may be, I mean, it could be factors of 2. Just, I mean, maybe there are 15 million people going to community colleges if you actually start this.
What's going to happen to the high school jobs?
Say that again?
What's going to happen to the low?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's actually on my list. So what happens in the market, for instance, for laborers and construction jobs? That's going to start to go up because there are going to be fewer of them around. So there's going to be a shift in that direction. This causes all sorts of weird shifts in all sorts of labor markets, like our minimum wage in Seattle. Causes all sorts of distortions, yeah.
How would this affect the dynamics of having a degree? Would it decrease, like, would it be less value to have an associate's degree and just remain as a status quo? Like, so, like,
it'll probably, well, it'll certainly be, when you look at the labor markets, and if you look at the labor market for people that have 15 years of education, the supply is going to go up, so the price is going to go down. So it could stagnate that end of the market a bit. But you can extend that even farther. What's going to happen? So you do this. In the first 2 years, these two groups of educational institutions, the four-year colleges and for-profit colleges, are ripping their hair out. Because all of a sudden, you know, they don't have students, or the quality of the students changes drastically for a couple of years. So the only people that are going to, you know, Wellesley and places like that are the people who can get in their community college. So they have to pay for them, being facetious. But in any case, I mean, you have this, for at least a couple of years, you have that effect, because the demand for these things shifts back a lot. And then what happens? Boom. You got all these people that finished their associate's degree, maybe twice as many. And, you know, if you want to go to community college and do a basic 2 years of college, you can do that. These days, with the number of adjuncts they have teaching at four-year institutions, half the time you're getting the same faculty, so it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But what happens at the end of 2 years? Well, then all of a sudden you have all these, and the demand for these bolts up. Now, it doesn't go up to the full amount, because some of these people that get associate degrees or some college don't end up going to four-year institutions. But it still sort of changes the dynamic in these labor markets as well. So it's an interesting economics problem that someone's going to have to deal with any way that they push this forward. And I don't think the administration thought 5 minutes more than it would be cool to do. It would be really cool to do free college degrees. And that's what we're dealing with, the cool factor.
If they did, I'm just saying, if they did pass that, wouldn't the 4 years and stuff have to increase their tuitions as well?
Yeah, at some point they either have to increase, they have to increase their tuitions in one way or another. And the whole dynamic of the university would change. So you would no longer have, you would to some extent, you'd have a small freshman and sophomore class. But then all of a sudden, junior year would be the year that people come in. I mean, God, it's got all sorts of cool implications. So the people that go to Ohio State and the University of Michigan for their first 2 years are basketball players and football players, because the community colleges don't have football teams, because they don't make them. So people are going to be making decisions on all sorts of weird margins. But yeah, they're going to have to increase their prices. And they'll have to expand, because now they're dealing with high school graduates that want to go to college, and that proportion of community college graduates that want to go to college. But after the second year, they have all the high school kids, and a lot more of them, because they now get paid for it, which is the purpose of doing this. And they have everybody that's going in the JC system to begin with. Yes.
I know Brahma briefly mentioned this in the State of the Union, but he also mentioned more subsidies for university tuition. So,
Right.
like, how would that also affect the supply demand curve as well?
Well, he's talking about more subsidies in the form of availability of loans, if I'm not mistaken. So it'll increase the price because people no longer have budget constraints. So I won't ask how many of you have student loans, but I'll make myself unpopular by saying I hate student loans. I don't think they should have any student loans, because I think what student loans have done is just jack up the price of universities. They let different people in, but they jack up the price in a huge way. And the federal government subsidizing it doesn't help the situation at all. It's just sort of distorted the system.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it almost be counterproductive, because like if you're going to community college for free, but they raise the price of the 4 years, so you transfer you end up almost paying more than you would have just
And you probably are, and you probably are paying more. And actually, in some ways, I mean, if this were truly a competitive market and they could really get the value of it, what you're willing to pay to go to college is the present value of what your increase in income would be for going to college as opposed to not going to college. So that's, at least that's how an economist looks at it. There's some payoff there. And you look at it, here's your lifetime increase in earnings. And I also think that it's not totally clear to me when you look at labor markets that what we teach and what you learn in college makes you a hell of a lot more productive when you enter the labor market. It makes you self-selective. It means, yeah, you went and had to sit in a classroom and listen to some economics professor babble on for an hour and a half at a time. But it may not give you a set of skills. I mean, the set of skills you're getting are socialization, you know how to use computers, you know how to communicate better. There are a whole bunch of things, but I'm not sure it's 4 years. And having said that, I'll make you all think I'm really crazy. I think that 3/4 of you at least are business majors. I would be much happier if you were art history and English and history and other stuff majors. Because you're in school because you're trying to increase your income or get a profession or something. And I prefer you were in school because you wanted to learn art history or French or some different thing, which a lot of people will stand up and say, no, it's not worth going to school to do that. So I hire, let's see, I've got 3 guys. I would say over the last 15 years, I've got 20 people in my office who I train to do fairly sophisticated econometric analysis. That's what we do. I now have 5 of them in there. 6, including the woman that runs the place. She's actually got a master's in econ. I would say out of the 20 that I've had in there, the best person I ever had a degree in philosophy from Leeds. The guy that ran my office for 10 years and is now running a trucking company has a master's degree in early English literature. And what I found, and I've had econ people and I've had business majors in, and I found, and I've had good econ majors and good business majors, etc. But I found that part, at least at an undergraduate level, isn't as important as you would think it is. It's important if you're going to get an accounting degree, God help you. But for other things, it's really not. You don't learn a hell of a lot more in marketing than you would going working in a marketing firm. Same thing with organizations and management and all that stuff. It's all just sort of you wing it once you get there. So, if you want to go home and tell your parents that your professor said, your econ professor said you should switch to art history, they can talk to me, I'll back you up. Okay. We're going to leave this right now. But this is the level of analysis you guys are already ready to do. You can start looking at this. And then, what we will do to it when we come back to this, and we're going to come back to it in a very detailed way, we're going to look at the concept of price discrimination. And you'll note that when you applied all the colleges you applied to, and some of you applied to 2 and a few of you applied to 23, they all asked you for a financial aid form. And they even asked you for financial aid forms when you didn't really care whether you got financial aid or not, or at least you didn't think you were going to get financial aid. That's because universities are the classic example of being able to price discriminate, and they collect information that allows you to do that. So we'll see how that system changes what we're seeing here in a big way when we start going through that. It's fun analysis. So what we want to do today is continue on with elasticity a bit, and then do an application of elasticity. So we talked about demand and elasticities and various demand elasticities. And we really looked at three of them. We looked at price elasticity was equal to the percentage change in price over the percentage change in quantity of the same good. We looked at cross-price elasticity, which would be percentage change. Percentage change in quantity of good X and change of the percentage change in price of good Y, where Y is either a substitute or a complement. And we looked at income elasticity is equal to the percentage change in quantity of good X, percentage change in income. And we saw that could be positive or negative depending on whether the goods are normal good or inferior good. Price elasticity talks about movement along the curve, along the demand curve. These are both shifts. And this is sort of completing the whole bloody review. We describe elasticity as either being elastic demand, which is greater than 1, so the percentage change in quantity is greater than the percentage change in price, less than 1 or equal to 1. And surprisingly enough, an awful lot of goods, maybe it's not surprising, maybe it's just I haven't thought about it enough. An awful lot of goods have elasticities right around 1. But there are inferior goods on the income side, and there are goods that are very inelastic and very elastic. So gasoline and beer are very inelastic. Hershey bars are very elastic. Milk turns out to be fairly elastic. What we didn't look at, one more thing. We also talked in terms of the shape of these things. So there's a demand curve, and a straight line demand curve has an elastic portion, a unitary elastic portion, and an inelastic portion, depending on when. The farther down you move on the demand curve, the more inelastic it becomes. Okay, and the more elastic in this direction. But we also have, and I'm not sure we did this, we can look at two demand curves. So you have two demand curves up there. One's a flat demand curve, one's a steep demand curve. We will go ahead and say, and we will analyze things in the context of, we will say this curve is more inelastic than this curve. So the steeper the demand curve, or as it turns out we're going to see the supply curve too, the steeper that curve is relative to some other curve, the more inelastic it's going to be. Less quantity change is all you're looking at. So those are sort of mechanical pieces going on with this. So we also have this thing called supply elasticity. And supply elasticity is going to be equal to the percentage change in quantity over the percentage change in price of the same good. But how's it different than demand elasticity? Well, demand elasticities are really all negative, right? Supply elasticities are positive. In other words, if the price goes up, the quantity firms are willing to supply goes up. It just says we have an upward sloping supply curve. we really are not going to deal with some of these cross-price elasticities and things like that at this point. They do when they do sophisticated demand studies. We don't need to do that. What we do need to do is recognize that there's a relatively flat supply curve. And we'll describe that relatively flat supply curve as being an elastic curve. It's relatively elastic. We'll describe this supply curve as being inelastic. And in fact, we'll describe that supply curve as being perfectly inelastic. Can anybody think of anything that might be perfectly inelastic in supply, at least over a short period of time? As it turns out, and we'll do some analysis with this in a little bit, rental housing and housing in general, in a really short run, is really inelastic in supply. Firms can't build them instantly. Anything that it takes a while to put together and build and get on the marketplace, we would say there's relatively inelastic supply curve for. Other things they can just pull off the market very quickly, or they can save it, or services, of course, are very elastic and stop hiring people to do things very quickly. Anything else for supply? And what really makes goods more or less elastic in supply is really the ease that firms can enter and exit the marketplace. So how fast can they slow down production? How long does it take them to speed up production? That's really determining part of what's going in here. What's their technology look like? And then what their cost structure is in general. Do they get tied into long-term fixed contracts so it doesn't cost much to stay in business? So the reason, for instance, that certain oil wells have not shut down in the Dakotas and in the Canadian sand oil fields is because all their investment was up front. So they had very high investment up front, where if they were looking at it today, they never would have invested at prices of $2 a gallon of gasoline. But they don't have to get out of business now because it's relatively cheap to keep running them. So they're going to have a different sort of supply response. Any questions on these? We're about to do an application. Okay. So, one of the classic applications of the amount of economics that you already know, and probably know better even at this point than half of the legislative team from Washington and most of the people in Olympia, is tax analysis. So we're going to look at two types of taxes here. First, we're going to look at something called a unit tax. And then we'll distort it a little bit and look at percentage sales taxes. So I should tell you this. The unit tax is not terribly common. So what I'm saying is, regardless of the price of the good, they add on $1 or they add on $2. As it turns out, federal gasoline taxes and state gasoline taxes are all unit taxes. That's the one thing that sort of stands out as being a unit tax. Most sales taxes are what? They're percentage taxes. in King County, it's 9.6%. So we'll start out with, here's a good, quantity per unit of time in dollars, and we'll start out with the assertion that we have no taxes in the marketplace, and then we have some sort of market equilibrium. So we have QE and P. And we put a per unit tax on this thing. Now we can show the per unit tax in two different ways. Let's just do it over here. You can either shift the demand curve in this way by the amount of the tax, or the amount of the tax. Let's say the tax is $1, and this is equal to $1. Look up. So this is $1. Not on graph yet. And all I'm saying is, okay, if we find where the difference between these two lines is $1, that's actually, so this distance is equal to $1. That's the amount of shift that goes on. So in this case, we've shifted the demand curve down. Okay, we could have, let's do it. We could have shifted the supply curve back up. So again, we have the same distance. It doesn't change what we're going to do. Either one works. So the difference between the old demand curve and the demand curve for the dollar tax is exactly $1 at any quantity. That distance is always $1. Everybody with me? Is that how we got there? Okay. So if you impose this tax, and just so you have a reference point, the federal gasoline tax is 18 cents. So it's the same tax. It may go back to prior to 1990, but it's been the same tax forever, which is why people are saying now's a good time to raise it, but there are other arguments for not doing that. So there's the old quantities. Well, the new demand and supply curve intersect there. So there's the quantity with the tax, but there's the price with the tax. So keep in mind what demanders are paying. They're paying the tax. So what do you think that is? So keep in mind what's going on. Demanders are paying this much for the good. Actually, they're paying this much for the good. The firm is getting this much, right? And there's $1, $1 times QT is the total tax revenue that's being paid out. So this is the tax revenue. Everybody see that so far? There's nothing complicated here. All we're doing is saying, we're selling this many of them, we're selling them at this price, and $1 times 2 QT has to come off the top for the tax man. So that's all we've done so far. But you can see what's happened in the market price. See that triangle with the 3 blue dots? What was that formerly? That's consumer surplus, right? That's consumer surplus in the free market. Where's consumer surplus now? Consumer surplus now is that triangle above there. Okay? So the first thing you can do is say, well, gee, consumer surplus has gotten smaller. Okay, so consumers are not as happy as they used to be. And likewise, you could go ahead and say, I need another color, but I won't do it. Yeah, I'll do it. Yeah. But you're lucky. It's confusing when they're all in pre-code. Oh. Maybe purple. So, the 3 purple dots are the corners of a triangle, which are what? That's producer surplus in the open market non-tax situation, right? What happens when you impose the tax on it and you cut back to QT? Well, this is how much the firm actually gets, right? So the producer surplus is now this triangle here. So the producer's not happy either. And the producer's not happy because this used to be, he's lost this much producer surplus. And the consumer's not happy because he's lost this much consumer surplus. Did I say that right? The producer lost producer surplus, the consumer lost consumer surplus. So the first thing you should say to yourself is, well, they're losing gains from trade. Producers losing gains from trade, the consumers losing gains from trade. Why in the world would they allow themselves to be taxed? And this becomes relatively simple to answer. It's because the government gets PT minus PF, which is equal to $1 in this case, times QT in tax revenue. And what does it do with that tax revenue? I'm being pure and I believe everything we're told at this point. What does it do with that tax revenue? It goes out and buys things that are good, that we wouldn't do ourselves. Public goods, defense, education, roads, infrastructure, all that stuff. It doesn't do anything bad with it. No drones, okay. And that's why we tax ourselves. We tax ourselves because even though we're losing more than that, right? We're not just losing the amount we get back in total revenue, and that's going to government. What else are we losing? We're losing this. That's the gains from trade that existed before that's actually less than the total revenue. That triangle has a classic name. It's the dead weight loss of taxation. And basically, it's the loss of gains from trade from goods that could be produced and consumed that we're giving up so that we can give this government money so they can spend money on our behalf. all the arguments we have over taxation, whether they're income arguments or consumption tax arguments or sales tax or unit tax, all center on this issue. And the issue is basically this: is this loss of consumer surplus, this loss of producer surplus, and the combined losses of consumer surplus and producer surplus of the deadweight triangle, are those losses to us as private consumers and producers of goods smaller than what the government provides us by spending money for us? That's the basic tax argument everybody's had ever since people started cutting off people's heads if they didn't pay taxes, 1,000 years ago. That's the argument. And of course, then you lost your head, so it was more expensive. It just wasn't loss of gains from trade that you had. But it's the same argument. So, there is this deadweight loss of taxation. It always exists whenever we have some sort of taxation. I wouldn't say always, we'll see an exceptional case, except in very exceptional cases. There's going to be some deadweight loss of taxation. And there's always loss of producer surplus and or consumer surplus. And I guess the other thing we can always say is, well, for the most part, both producers and consumers bear the burden of the tax. So you will hear an argument sometimes that, oh gee, the producer is simply going to pass this on to the consumer. And what we're going to see in a minute is the producer can pass some of it on, may not be able to pass all of it on. And in some instances, may not be able to pass any of it on. Depends on the sets of circumstances. Any questions, comments, rocks to be thrown? Okay. Okay, so how do we tax? So let's start with your favorite topic and my favorite topic. Why do you think we tax booze? People still buy it. So if they still buy it, what does that say about elasticity of booze? It's inelastic. So we're taxing an inelastic good. It's going to have less effect on output. So there's the demand curve for booze. And actually, the fact of the matter is, booze in general is very inelastic. Okay? My guess is that in 5 years, we're going to find out in the state of Washington that the elasticity of booze is greater in Washington and Colorado than it is in other states, because we now have a legal substitute for getting high, which is pot. I mean, not being facetious. We'll see, there are better substitutes now than there used to be. Let's say this is the supply curve. And there's the demand curve. And we impose this tax. I'm going to put the tax on the supply curve this time, just say the supplier's paying, it doesn't make any difference. So the amount of the tax is this much. So really we're taking the unit tax over here, and we're just figuring out where they're that far apart, and we have a supply plus the tax curve. Maybe we should do some things. So I just put up an alternative scenario here. So instead of taxing all booze with a unit tax, all we're doing is taxing Irish whiskey. So you got Jameson's over here. And Jameson's, because it has all these substitutes, which is all the other Irish whiskeys and all the other whiskeys and all the other booze and all that stuff, it has what sort of demand curve relative to this one?
Elastic.
It's more elastic, it's flatter. So what we're depicting here is a flatter curve. When we put the tax on here, then we go, that's tax revenue. And you see quantity with the tax, quantity without the tax, there's a big shift. And if we look over here, we get this big amount of tax revenue and a relatively small shift in the quantity that people purchase. That's why we tax things like booze and gasoline, certain soon-to-be marijuana. I think we're putting this sort of tax. I think some of it's already on there, but it's going to be more so. They should tax the hell on it. It's a great revenue producer. But you can see why we tax certain things. We tax certain things because, first of all, despite the fact that they tell you they tax booze because it's sinful, they tax booze because it generates huge amounts of revenue. The state of Washington has a huge alcohol tax. It's the highest alcohol tax in the United States. If you ever want to test that proposition, you go to State Line, Idaho, look at the price of booze there, and then you cross into Spokane, and boom, the price is half. It's really, actually, it gets cheaper as you move away from the border, because the Idahoans already figured that out. But that's the effect of the tax. Same thing with Canada. It's like you got to get in line across the border. We tax these things because they're revenue generators. Cigarettes fit the same way. Very inelastic demand. So the question here is, it's the question for both of them. Who bears the burden of the tax? And when I say that, what I mean by, and this is a classic phrase, I mean this, they have hearings in Congress over who bears the burden of taxes. Okay, who bears the burden of the tax here? Well, in this particular case, you can see look up for a second. So this triangle here, dealing with the original quantity and the original price, etc., that triangle is what? That's producer surplus, right? What happens to producer surplus? Well, it gets a little smaller. This disappears. And in fact, it's a transfer to the government, and that's how we should look at it. It's a transfer from producers to the government, and then this is the deadweight loss associated with the producers. What is, if you look at, I can't even do it here because it's way up here. What is this triangle? That's consumer surplus from booze. So, who are these people? They're the alcoholics. The people that want booze no matter what. Okay, and when you put the tax on, we go to here. Here's the price they pay, price plus the tax. What is this stuff? Well, this is part of the tax revenue that's going to the government. That's the part that's coming from consumers. The rectangle, this rectangle is the transfer to government. And what's that big triangle? That triangle is the deadweight loss associated with consumer surplus loss. Who bears the burden in this case? Consumers do. And the rule is basically this, we'll see it in a second. The more inelastic the demand for the good is, the more the consumer is going to bear the burden. And actually, we should say that in conjunction with assuming that the supply curve is stationary. We're comparing two demand curves. Now, if you look over here, what's that triangle? That's the producer surplus associated with producing Jamesons, right? And what is that triangle? That's the producer surplus associated with the market when there's a tax. Okay, so we go from this big producer surplus down to this little tiny producer surplus. And the consumer surplus actually gets small too. But who bears the brunt of this tax? The producer does. The consumers simply switch over. They go buy some other whiskey, or whatever the case may be. What does the producer do? The producer of Jameson's bears almost the entire burden of this tax. Oops, there it is there. That becomes revenue. These are the deadweight losses. So the more inelastic the supply curve is relative to the demand curve, the more the supplier will do it. And the way to look at this is bear the burden. The way to look at this is pretty simple. Taxes will generally be borne by both producers and consumers. The more inelastic one of their curves is, the more it will be borne by that particular entity. And in fact, we can come up with scenarios that we have a cure for Ebola here. So the demand for Ebola or Ebola cure looks something like this. This is the supply curve of producing that. We start out in equilibrium, it looks like that. If you put a $10 tax on this stuff, we shift the curve by $10. There's the tax and there's the tax revenue. But what happens to the amount that's actually sold in the marketplace? It barely changes at all. Who bears the burden of the tax? The person that needs the drug, the consumer in this case. Let's say this is short-run housing in January in North Dakota. So you can't build very much. There's very inelastic supply. It's almost vertical. People can move around a bit, or they can buy an extra dog, or whatever it is, but they're not moving around a lot. And this is what they were paying before, and maybe the way, I basically have this perfectly inelastic supply. There's the tax revenue. Who's bearing the burden here? So the supplier's bearing the entire burden here. In other words, the tax is based, if you have perfectly inelastic supply, the supplier will bear all the burden. If you have perfectly inelastic demand, the demander will bear all the burden. Those are rare instances. Now you can start to see, if you looked at those tables that I handed out last time, you'll see that there were, if you looked at food in general, if you looked at lettuce or you looked at chicken or something, you may get inelastic or almost unitary elastic demand for most foodstuffs. If you look at food in general, what do you expect the elasticity looks like? Very inelastic. We don't tax food in Washington for two reasons. One, it's borne almost entirely by consumers if you do a general tax on all food. But also because there's an income elasticity associated with it. And it's sort of in a different way, but rich people don't spend as much money on their food as poor people do, so the poor people bear a larger burden. That's when we talk about progressive versus regressive taxes. Regressive taxes are those taxes in which lower income people pay a higher proportion of their income than wealthy people do. Progressive taxes, like our income tax system, is when you have the richer people pay higher proportions of taxes. Which if you read the media today, you wouldn't believe that we have a progressive tax system, but we do. It may not be progressive enough, but it's progressive. But a lot of the sales tax systems you see in the United States are based on this premise of you don't have the consumers bear all the burden and don't hurt the poor. Washington State happens to have a very regressive tax system. Yes.
I remember a while back, like Florida had a little bit of free, so a lot of oranges.
Right.
Supply like was really limited, but wouldn't that hurt both sides? Or
Well, freeze does. Actually, not necessarily.
the prices do go up.
Right. It depends on how the prices go. So you're ahead of this at this point, but I'll give you the example. It's not really a tax question, it's a different question. So in the inelastic, let's say we're looking at coffee, and you're a coffee speculator, and coffee is sold in the, it is such that if you raise the price, total revenue goes up. But for whatever reason, there are too many competitors out there, it's a free market, whatever the case is, you sell coffee for $2 a pound, whatever you sell at the wholesale price. What do you pay for if you're a coffee speculator? You pay for coffee freezes. You want half the crop destroyed. Because if half the crop's destroyed, the price goes way up, but the total revenue goes up even more. So it depends on that elasticity of demand and the sort of market. We'll see when we're looking at commodities markets, but that's an issue. I mean, it looks like it might be terrible, but anybody fish in Alaska? You commercially fish at all? Yeah, I mean, people hate up there when there's an abundance of fish because the price falls too low. And total revenue actually goes down. I mean, I've been up there when the price of pink salmon off the boat was 7 cents a pound. And just, you know, people are landing fish and they've got an entire boatload of fish and they get a check for $1,500.
Sometimes like with the coat, like I remember when I was up there, Seattle area caught way a ton of crab, and it
Just
also,
killed the price.
it also lowered the price as well in Alaska because we didn't have that much crab up there, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, they're interesting trade-offs. I mean, the worry now in Alaska now with the crab, and we're getting way off topic here, but so the opilio crab, which is one of the king crabs that are up there, have, through their love of Mr. Putin or whatever the reason is, have crossed into the Bering Sea. So, 30 years ago, there was no fishery for king crab in the Bering Sea, in other words, on the European side of the Arctic. Now there's this tremendously successful king crab fishery over there, and it's killing prices. It's killing everybody's prices, and it's killing total revenue, which is why now you can get crab a lot cheaper than you used to. And the same thing is true of lobster. All of a sudden, all those lobsters are out. You can buy lobster for the same price today that you can buy it in 1970. Same sort of phenomenon, but different than the tax question. Do you guys see what's going on here? Okay, we're just going to do this other one so we don't need a break here. We're going to do one more of this. There's one more switch here that we'll make. And this is relatively simple. I just want to make sure you see this and you understand where it comes from. So as I said, if you look at gasoline, federal or state gasoline taxes, certain alcohol taxes are per unit. I think one of Washington's taxes, Washington has a bunch of taxes on alcohol now, but one of them is the per unit tax. Most taxes that we see of the sort we're talking about here are percentage taxes. So you take the tax rate, which here is, let's say, 0.89, I don't know what it is, times the price of the good, and that's the tax you pay. So we're always paying an 8.9% tax. So the way you look at that graphically, look up for a second. You take this endpoint of the supply curve and you go to the point that's 1.089 higher. So that's the amount of the tax. All we've done is add on 8.9% of the tax. And then this supply curve, since the supplier is paying for it, looks like that with a tax on it. And the space between this supply curve and this supply curve is always 8.9%. That's all we're doing now. The only difference here is on the unit tax, you have a parallel shift. And on this tax, you have a percentage shift. It goes up a steeper angle. That's all that's happening. But again, this is the typical sales tax both in the United States and Europe. Yes, sir?
Why is it steeper again? Why is the...
Well, because the space between this is always a percentage difference. It's not a per unit difference. So the slope has just become a little bit steeper. And before we were keeping this distance always $1. Now it's got to go up by $1, and then so the tax, the tax when it's a price of $1 is 8.9 cents. When it's $2, it's 17.8 cents. So that's the difference in the two. Otherwise, the analysis is the same. You start out with an equilibrium point, you've got a new equilibrium, you've got tax revenue. It's there. And you have the same analysis in terms of this is deadweight loss, that triangle out there, and you have loss of consumer surplus and loss of producer surplus that's transferred to the government, and the government again goes and spends money for us on something that we think has value. So when Obama was talking, he was talking last night about other forms of taxes. So he was talking about income taxes on extremely wealthy people, which is a whole different scenario that we'll come to later. But it has different implications for how that money is spent. So for instance, he's essentially saying that we have free child care. He wants to provide free child care. which, believe it or not, if you go to Europe, people have free childcare. It's just a different way of looking at things. But the way he's going to do that is financing it some other way. It's going to change demand, it's going to change that market. We don't, at this point in time, we don't have, getting back to Obama, if you have free childcare all of a sudden, the way he's going to do it is through a tax credit. The demand curve for childcare is going to shift down a lot. And you're going to get more expensive childcare because you're just going to have to hire people that are going to be more expensive childcare providers. What was the other one? There was one more. Okay, I won't dive into this. So on Friday, today Wednesday, today's Wednesday. So on Friday, let me give you this first. Okay. Yeah. It is 1:30, yeah, that's right. You can't do that, I can't read this. Blind leading the unable to decipher in this case, right? Okay, that's 1:30, and then on page 169, there's 1, A and B, 5, 3, 6, and 8. Do those, we're going to go over them. There's also on Canvas a set of practice problems just dealing with when the supply shifts. You should give those a whirl. We will spend all of Friday doing a review for the test on Monday, which is basically you guys are going to be doing problems with me. So do these, don't wait for me to wait. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow.